Welcome to a new video lesson. In today's lesson, I will analyze some of the chapters of Pride and Prejudice. So, let's begin. Today, let us begin with chapter 21. In chapter 21, Mr. Collins's resentment does not shorten his visit. The following day, the girls meet Mr. Wickham in Meryton. He tells Elizabeth that he kept away from the ball as he considered it advisable not to meet Darcy in case unpleasant scenes should arise. That morning, Jane receives a farewell letter from Caroline Bingley saying that the whole party is leaving Netherfield at once to join her brother, who has gone to town to conduct some business. The letter makes it plain that Miss Bingley does not intend any of a party to return to Netherfield that winter. Miss Bingley hints in the letter that her brother admires Darcy's sister greatly, and that she hopes that a permanent attachment will be formed between them. Jane, at first is naturally depressed, is eventually cheered up to some extent by her sister, who suspects that Miss Bingley wishes to keep her brother away from Jane. So, this chapter offers a further contrast between the two Bennet sisters, where Jane is soft, trusting, and guileless. On the other hand, Elizabeth is perceptive and clever. Jane is easily disturbed by her emotions. Elizabeth is, on the other hand, fairly stable. Okay. Elizabeth sees that Caroline's letter is at best a display of ignorance and most likely an attempt to discourage Jane from pursuing Bingley, that is Mr. Bingley, further. She is able to analyze the situation and knows that Darcy has also some role in taking Bingley away from Jane. Later, we will discover that Elizabeth is right. This episode is, of course, important for the plot purpose in the fact that the separation of Bingley and Jane becomes more serious. The reader's suspense is raised by it. Jane is too naive to understand the schemings of Caroline and too honest to believe they exist. Okay, so what we see here is that in the previous chapter also, the influence of Wickham over the lady, that is Elizabeth, was so great that she feels unhappy when he is absent from the ball at Netherfield. He succeeds in impressing her about his own word to the extent of making her forget that he has kept himself away from the ball, though he had boasted that he was not afraid of Darcy, and the latter's presence would not prevent him from accepting invitation for the ball. Okay. Elizabeth is thoroughly unaware of the inconsistency between Wickham's words and his actions when she meets him later, and even praises him for his judgment in keeping himself away. Though Elizabeth is to blame for such a hasty partiality for him, it certainly cannot be denied that few women can resist his charm. Aunt Gardiner warns Elizabeth against her partiality for him, and though Elizabeth tries to make light for her fears, she is certainly disappointed when she discovers that Wickham has transferred his affection to Miss King. Okay, so that will open in, though it is not present in chapter 21, in later chapters this will open the eyes of Elizabeth to the real worth of Wickham. Okay, uh, we will see that in the next chapters. Okay, so in chapter 22, Charlotte Lucas earns Elizabeth's gratitude by listening to Mr. Collins, which keeps him in a good humor. Miss Lucas um, schemes to make Mr. Collins interested in her, and with such success that he entreats her to name the day. Sir William and Lady Lucas are and the rest of the family are delighted with the match. Charlotte tells Elizabeth the news in confidence. Her friend is horrified that Charlotte should marry the insufferable Collins, but Charlotte prefers marriage with Mr. Collins to the lonely future which she risks if she does not accept his proposal. Okay, so the economic basis of marriage is emphasized in this chapter. The Lucas family feel triumphant about the proposal of Mr. Collins. It is a financial boon to them. They not only have the family estate to themselves now, but also the likelihood of coming into possession of Longbourn. This chapter also shows how Elizabeth has been mistaken about the character of one of her friends, Charlotte Lucas. The latter admits, "I am not romantic, you know." I am quoting from the text. "I am not romantic, you know. I never was. I ask only for a comfortable home." Okay, so the marriage is of sustenance. Jane Austen is not a romantic person either, but she clearly disapproves of a marriage based on such materialistic grounds. Charlotte stands as a contrast to Elizabeth. The latter has a more ideal view of marriage and will consent to marriage only when the ideal has the possibility of being fulfilled. In chapter 3, shortly after Charlotte's confidence, Sir William Lucas, that is Charlotte's father, arrives and announces to the Bennets his daughter's engagement. Mrs. Bennet is extremely put out of this news, and a week passes before she can see Elizabeth without scolding her. She is sour and ill-natured with the Lucases for a month, and it takes such a longer period for her to forgive Charlotte. Collins returns to Hertfordshire and writes to say that Lady Catherine heartily approves his marriage and wishes to take the place soon. Okay. Meanwhile, Jane is concerned by the fact that she has not received any news about Bingley from his sister as she had expected. A fortnight later, Collins returns to Longbourn, where he is not a welcome visitor. However, he spends most of his time at Lucas Lodge. Mrs. Bennet looks upon Charlotte with zealous abhorrence as her successor at Longbourn. Okay, so see the dynamics of relationship that is happening between these people. Those things are based on the idea of marriage. Those things are based on the social principles of distribution of property or the inheritance of property. This chapter brings to a conclusion the first volume of the novel as was originally published. Okay, uh, the first volume ends with a very black moment. All seems destroyed or threatened. Charlotte's marriage to Mr. Collins seemed to be undeniable evidence of the economic forces which control human lives, and how it has long term effect on Longbourn, which is running into the minds of Mrs. Bennet. Okay, on the lower scale, human antagonists are hindering the happiness of Bennet girls. Elizabeth has no doubt that Darcy and Caroline are deliberately obstructing the course of Bingley's true love. Elizabeth's prejudice against Darcy is another barrier. Okay. So what we see here is that Mr. Collins, in spite of rejection from Elizabeth, Mr. Collins is not caught down for long and does not leave Longbourn as expected. He merely transfers his affection to Charlotte and proposes to her the very next day and is accepted. Okay, so it's mixture of chapter 22 and 23. Uh, after coming to Longbourn, it was his main wish or main target to get married, and he does that and he gets married. He would, in spite of Elizabeth. He thinks that he has taken sufficient revenge on the ungrateful girl, that is Elizabeth, by fixing up the marriage with Charlotte. He leaves Longbourn only on the day originally fixed by him, after promising to come again, and a letter of thanks for all the hospitality that had been extended to him. His offer to come again surprises the Bennets, since they have been kept in dark about the engagement to Charlotte. His letter of thanks arrives, and he too, as arranged. He is not ruffled in the least at his being rejected by Elizabeth. It seems to be his view that if she had not accepted so much, the worse for her. Okay, the subplot of the novel, that is the Jane and Bingley episode, which is not moving forward, is given an impetus by the letter written by Jane to Caroline in chapter 24. Jane has written to Caroline, and Miss Bingley writes back to say that they are all settled in London for the winter. The letter is full of praise for Miss Darcy, okay, in whose brother's house Mr. Bingley is staying. Okay, Elizabeth points out to Jane that Mr. Bingley's sisters are trying to influence him to forget Jane, but the latter will not hear any criticism of Caroline and Mrs. Hertz, that is Jane. Jane, a simplistic person she is, she would not find anything demeaning in them. Elizabeth has been rudely shocked by Charlotte's acceptance of Mr. Collins and Mr. Bingley's coldness towards Jane. She says she is greatly dissatisfied with the world, which every day confirms her belief of the inconsistency of human character and of deceptiveness of appearance of either merit or of sense. Okay, so the plot as the first volume ended here, when it was first published, the first volume ended in today's chapter 23. So the plot in this chapter takes another bad turn with the definite extension of Bingley's stay in London This is the second example of Bingley's inconsistency of how little dependence can be placed on the appearance of either merit or sense. Okay. Wickham becomes more relentless in the criticism of Darcy until he has the entire countryside convinced of Darcy's vindictive and proud nature. Nevertheless, Elizabeth still fails to see through Darcy's appearance, and it is left to the naive Jane to defend him. Thus, Elizabeth, for all her perception, fails to understand intricate people who stand in a relation of intimacy with her. Hence, she is unable to understand Charlotte's motive in marrying Collins and also unable to understand Darcy. It is said that love reveals the essence of a woman's character, and Elizabeth is no exception. Her excellences as well as defects are found in the development of her attitude towards Darcy and Wickham. For all her penetrating judgment, Elizabeth's one defect is prejudice, as Darcy's is pride. She judges Collins from his first letter, and her early opinion of Lady Catherine is justified by her personal experience of the lady. She understands Miss Bingley's nature too very well, but she fails woefully in understanding Darcy. And Wickham also, and chiefly her own heart. She is prejudiced against Darcy by his offensive remark made by him about her in the beginning. Though she moves with him on polite terms, she never talks to him. But rather does not let the later talks leave an impact on her. Her impression about him is confirmed about his habitual reserve, but she does not realize that pride is only a superficial defect in him, and that there are worthy qualities in him which will come to the surface on proper occasions. In a similar manner, she is utterly deceived about Wickham. To a certain extent, she is carried away by his appearance and winning manners, and also due to the prejudice that she already had for Darcy. She does not realize that manners do not form character. She is predisposed in his favor and even falls in love with him to an extent. She is ready to believe that all that he says against Darcy, and her prejudice against the latter is increased by her prejudice in favor of Wickham. Okay, so this is enhanced throughout the novel to certain extent, but Elizabeth is unable to forgive Darcy for the remarks that has hurt her own pride. Okay, and that leads to all the dispositions, all the prejudices in the later sections, later chapters. Okay. In chapter 25, Mr. Collins returns again to Hertfordshire, and Mrs. Bennet's brother and his wife, that is Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, come to spend Christmas at Longbourn. Mrs. Bennet tells her sister how disappointed she is that Jane and Elizabeth are not yet engaged or married. Mrs. Gardiner is younger than Mrs. Bennet and is sympathetic towards Jane and Elizabeth. She suggests that a change of scene may do Jane good in her disappointment over Bingley and suggests that she should return to London with Mr. Gardiner and herself. Jane accepts the invitation with pleasure. I would like to remind you that Bingleys are also in London. Okay, so Mr. Gardiner spent considerable time in Derbyshire before her marriage and knows the part where Wickham belongs, so that he and she had many acquaintances in common. Wickham is able to give news of this. Mrs. Gardiner has also seen Pemberley and knew the late Mr. Darcy well. She has a vague recollection that she has heard Mr. Darcy spoken of as a very proud, ill-natured boy. Okay, so far the situation is stagnant because of the distance separating Bingley from Longbourn. However, the arrival of the Gardiners, the plot begins to move again with the promise of Jane's visit to London. There is a distinct possibility that the two may meet and be reconciled in spite of Darcy and Caroline. The attack by Jane Austen on contemporary notions of romantic love is to be noted here. Mrs. Gardiner sees that such love based on feelings and passion is swift and violent, but also vague, unpredictable also, and most importantly brief. Okay, Jane Austen's philosophy demands a love that is permanent and sensible, which develops through the course of knowing each other. Okay, the Gardiners are a sensible couple. They are amiable, intelligent, discreet, vastly superior to the other relatives of the Bennets. They cause no embarrassment to Elizabeth by the vulgarity of their conduct. So far, Elizabeth is surrounded by vulgar people. Now, Darcy's aunt, Lady Catherine, will make him blush, while the Gardiners, with their refined behavior, will prove to Darcy that good manners and breeding are not the preserve of any one class. Okay, because this is the main reason, as we will find later, this upbringing, this good manners is the main reason behind Darcy asking, or rather convincing Bingley to leave the prospect of being engaged with Jane. Okay, so in chapter 26, Mrs. Gardiner warns Elizabeth against falling in love with Wickham, who has no fortune. So, as I said before, Elizabeth replies that she is not in love with Wickham, although he is the most agreeable man she has ever seen. She promises her aunt that whatever happens, she will do nothing in a hurry. Okay, Mr. Collins's wedding is approaching fast and he is staying with the Lucases. The wedding takes place and the bride and groom leave for Kent from the church door. Charlotte has extracted a promise from Elizabeth that she will visit them in March. Jane arrives safely in London, but although she has written to Caroline Bingley telling her of her visit, she receives no reply. Okay, so the subplot is moving. The physical distance that was present between Bingley and Jane was lessened, but still the gap that is present emotionally is still a void. Okay, she writes to them, writes to Caroline, but Jane does not receive a reply. So what we see here is that we can see this novel plot depends on the exchange of letters also. The plot is moved forward, the characters are known through letters also, so it is a kind of epistolary letter. Okay, not fully it is an epistolary novel, sorry, it is not fully an epistolary novel, but its plot moves through the letters, so it has certain traits of epistolary novels which was prevalent in those times. Okay, it is not solely dependent on the letters, but some sections of the plot is moving forward through this. Okay, Jane thinks that the letter has gone astray and calls on Caroline, who professes to be glad to see Jane and declares that the letter did not reach her. So what we see here is that pretensions and everywhere, and also on Jane's part, she is simple, she is naive to the extreme point. What we see here is that as she does not receive any reply, she goes to visit Caroline, who professes that she did not get any letter from Jane. Caroline Bingley delays about 4 weeks before returning Jane's visit, and then only stays a short while. Of Mr. Bingley there is no sign. Okay, Jane now realizes that Caroline has not much regard for her and writes to Elizabeth telling her so. So again we see that all the things that are happening are informed back through the letter, and this moves the plot forward. Okay, so meanwhile Wickham has transferred his attentions from Elizabeth to a young lady who has just inherited £10,000. So what we see here is that Wickham's main motive is to earn money or get women and get involved with women who have profitable source of income or profitable property to their names. Okay, Elizabeth is not wounded at this and writes to inform her aunt, telling her that she feels only cordiality towards Wickham and Miss King, the young lady in this question. Okay, Jane seems to have matured in the process of being disillusioned to some extent. Okay, until now she has naively trusted everyone, but Bingley's failure to see her in London is convincing evidence that there is a strong appearance of duplicity. Jane Austen's favorite theme of self-education and growth is thus developed in this small subplot. Elizabeth ironically reveals that she is still hasty in her judgment and subject to prejudice. She must allow growth of character also. Clear? So what we see here is that there is a constant moving towards the climax scene. This action of Elizabeth transferring his affection towards Miss King, this action opens the eyes of Elizabeth to the real worth of Wickham. Though she writes to her aunt philosophically that handsome men must have something to live on like plain ones, even so, she does not know the full extent of the villainy he is capable of. Okay, which will be known to her only after she reads Darcy's letter about Wickham. Chapter 27 deals with what happens in March. In March, Elizabeth accompanies Sir William Lucas and his daughter Maria to stay with Charlotte. They are to spend a night in London and they drive to Mr. Gardiner's her house, where Jane is eagerly waiting for her sister. Mrs. Gardiner tells Elizabeth that Jane has periods of despondency owing to her disappointment over Bingley. Elizabeth thoroughly enjoys her short stay with the Gardiners and gladly accepts their invitation to spend a holiday with them the following year. Okay, so the economic motives for marrying are again traced here, this time from the male point of view, or also in the previous chapter also it has been pointed out. Wickham abandons Elizabeth in favor of Miss King only on financial grounds. Elizabeth is so familiar with the system that she seems quite resigned. She now is in an abandoned, exposed position without any real emotional support behind her. Her family continues to be unsympathetic. Jane is now engrossed in her own affairs. The support of Charlotte has also been lost. Okay, so what we see here is that she is totally alone. She is unhappy about her relationship with Darcy and nervous because she has discovered that she will meet his aunt, Lady Catherine, when she visits Charlotte. Okay, so Jane Austen has developed with thoroughness Elizabeth's state of mind at the time when she is to depart for Hertfordshire. The novelist has recognized the various elements present in Elizabeth's character at this juncture, organized them and woven them together into a coherent portrait of the heroine at the moment when she is being uprooted. It is one example of Jane Austen's penetrating insight and subtle artistry. Okay, so let's move on. In chapter 28, the following day, Elizabeth and the Lucases arrive in Hertfordshire, where they are met by Charlotte and Mr. Collins at the gate of the parsonage, which adjoins Rosings Park, that is Lady Catherine's country estate. Okay. Elizabeth notices that Mr. Collins is as pompous and boring as ever. They are taken over the house and grounds, shown the view of Rosings, and told that they will see Lady Catherine at church on Sunday. Charlotte seems contented with marriage and bears her husband's often vexations about or the vexatious behavior with composure. Okay, the next day, Maria Lucas, that is a sister of Charlotte, greatly excited, points out to Elizabeth two ladies in a low phaeton which has stopped at the garden gate. One of them is Miss Debog, who is thin, sickly, and cross looking. This pleases Elizabeth, who hopes Darcy will marry her and have a trying time. Okay, Mr. Collins and Charlotte stand talking to the ladies when they have gone to the former congratulates them on their good fortune, which turns out to be an invitation for the whole party to dine at Rosings the next day. Here is Jane Austen's portrayal of the result of marriage founded on convenience. Charlotte's home is indeed neat and comfortable, but she must also wisely be deaf to the foolishness of her husband. Only when Mr. Collins is forgotten was there really a great air of comfort throughout. This is Jane Austen's most bitter indictment of the marriage customs of England. A girl had no other alternative of career or profession and had to settle for a marriage of convenience in order to find economic security. Love is of no consequence in such marriages of convenience, and the readers have already heard about Lady Catherine being proud, dictatorial, and insolent. Here, the readers meet her in person as a formidable, loud, offensive, and foolish lady, an apt supervisor for the pompous Collins. Mr. Collins is his is in his usual fawing self, bowing to Lady Catherine, much to Elizabeth's amusement. So, what we see here is that um, Mr. Collins had not improved in the least after marriage. Elizabeth finds him to be the same man during her visit to Hertfordshire parsonage, which she undertakes for the sake of a dear friend Charlotte. Indeed, Mr. Collins looked upon it as an excellent occasion to bring home to Elizabeth what she had lost. He promises her the gracious attentions of Lady Catherine, and he is unable to control himself for joy when the invitation comes to him the very next day. Elizabeth notes his servility towards the gracious lady in person, and her contempt for him and sympathy for Charlotte's increase. Still, he calls upon her to congratulate him and his fortunate situation. When she speaks in mild praise of Lady Catherine for the sake of politeness, he is not satisfied with her enthusiasm and takes the matter into his own hands. Okay, so such is a picture of Mr. Collins given by Jane Austen. He is the embodiment of foolishness and servility mixed with self-importance. He is held up for ridicule as being typical of many clergymen of those days. Okay, so but some critics are not satisfied merely with such interpretation of his character, and there is much truth in what they say. According to them, Mr. Collins would not be the great comic character that he is if he were nothing more than a cringing toady. They see in him a poet of strange type. Mr. Priestley remarks, for example, that Jane Austen only once achieved poetry, and that was when she created Mr. Collins. Though he is no doubt a toady, he is not merely that. He is given to say that a fourth dimension. Though all dislike him, Jane Austen introduces him again even after he is comfortably settled with Charlotte at Hertfordshire. He must comment on the elopement of Lydia unasked. It is a characteristic of him that he writes a letter of warning about rumoured marriage of Elizabeth and Darcy. This gives rise to more satirical remarks of Mr. Bennet in his reply, in which he asks Collins to congratulate him and Lizzie for the impending alliance with Darcy. Okay, so Mr. Priestley puts it, she indulges him all over the place, just as Shakespeare was blackmailed by Falstaff again. I quote, that is from Just to Again. This is what it says. All these things provide that Mr. Collins is a person who is of servile character, who is foolish, and is mixed with the emotions of servility and of self-importance within him. Okay, so let's end it here today. We will continue the next sections in the next classes. Thank you.